Chapter 12. We made it to the end of the book. So, this chapter focuses on a little bit of project management and strategic planning, some good topics that can be applied to just about any aspect in business as well as in your personal life. So, with projects, we've got really three things that are driving us, three major things. One is the cost in any project. That will limit you as to what you can or can't do in a project. The other constraint that you have is the time. You can't take 20 years to implement a project unless you're the government. Uh, in today's global economy, things move at the speed of light, and so you have to be able to accomplish things in a reasonable amount of time. And any given project that will be uh, given to you as to what that is. And then, of course, there's the scope. What is it you're trying to accomplish? For example, when I worked for a local company, the general manager came to me and said he needed us to move a manufacturing cell from Portland to our sister company in Japan. And it needed to be done in 6 months. And he gave me a budget as to what it would cost. And so I knew what the scope was. I had to pack up an entire manufacturing cell currently located in Portland and get it implemented with our sister company. I knew how much money he'd given me to do it and when he wanted it done. So I had those constraints on that project. So, what's the process I used to make that happen? Which, by the way, I successfully got it set up with our sister company ahead of schedule and under budget. So how did I do that? Well, the first thing is the initiation of the project. That was the general manager coming and giving me approval to make it happen. Then I had to sit down and plan. I had to think about this. What does this entail? What are all the things that have to happen? And now I didn't do that by myself. I pulled together a team of people and laid out what the goal was, what we were trying to accomplish, and asked them what needs to happen. And I brought in people from throughout the organization: sales, manufacturing, engineering, purchasing, to give me their inputs as to what were the tasks that need to happen so that I could put together a plan. And then, of course, I had to execute the plan. And in executing that plan, that also involved monitoring the progress. And then I like that the author included this next one. There's a closing. There needs to be, how do you define when we're done? And what I did with all the projects I had in my career is when I got to the end and we were done, we had a party to celebrate. We did it. We got it done. And so the author just shows you that in project management in general, you have these cycles from the start date to the end date as to what it is, what the activities are that you're doing. So a little bit more about the initiating. So the groundwork, that was when I contacted people involved in the organization to get their inputs as to what we needed to do. That allowed me to come up and write an actual project charter and that said, this is what we're going to do. And then I had a kickoff meeting. And as part of the kickoff meeting, I had everyone, all the leaders that were involved in it, signed the project charter, saying that they were signing up to this and they agreed with it and to make it happen. Now, as a little aside there, moving a manufacturing cell from Portland to offshore was not necessarily a popular topic. And I knew that. So when I called the team together initially, the people from the various departments, I knew there was going to be concern that we were losing jobs in Portland. Nobody likes that. So I explained to them why we were doing it. Now, the reason the general manager had asked me to do this is because one of our largest customers, who had a manufacturing operation in Japan, had come to him and said they needed to reduce the shipping time from getting our product in Portland, which they were completely happy with, but it needed to be at their Japanese manufacturing plant where they assembled it into the final product. And they wanted to reduce that time to be able to respond more quickly to market changes. And so they asked us to set up a manufacturing location. It turns out there was uh, an unused business space right next to them that we were, could lease to set up manufacturing, so that they literally just had to walk next door to get the product when they needed it. But here's the caveat. They said if we couldn't do that, they would find someone else who could do it. So we had only two options. We could move the manufacturing cell and Portland would lose the jobs, but we would still, as a company, keep the business. Or we could say, no, we're not interested in that, and then lose their business. Now, they did also get us a carrot that said if we were successful in doing that, they would look at giving us some additional business for the Portland operation that currently they were sourcing from another vendor. But the key why I wanted to mention this is before I got started, I had identified what the objections might be from the people that this impacted. And I pulled them together and explained to them why we were doing it. Once they understood the why, I didn't get any complaints from people as they worked through it. They understood why, and they worked wholeheartedly to make it happen. Okay, so planning. Planning is essential. I love this quote from Benjamin Franklin. If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And that's true. The good project management, you're never, running from the, flying from, what do they say, by the seat of your pants. You're not shooting from the hip. You have a plan that you're executing. So don't shortcut that planning stage. It's really important to think it through and have a thorough plan. Now, things will change and happen along the way that you have to adjust to. So it's never perfect. It has to be fluid and dynamic. One of the tools for doing planning is a thing called a Gantt chart. And what you do with a Gantt chart is you list all the critical activities that need to happen for your project and the interrelatedness between those. There are some activities that you can't start this activity until this other activity is first completed. Other activities you can run independent of each other. And so you create this list and it will produce a chart that this is a real simple one that shows you what are the tasks, how are they related, and it will project out to you because you say how long each of these tasks are going to take. And it will show you if you start on this day, then you should be able to complete out on this time. It's really important to do that. Now, for the project I was talking about, moving the manufacturing cell to Japan, I created a Gantt chart. Now, my Gantt chart did not have 42 line items on it. If I recall correctly, it was about 350 that were on that. And the Gantt chart wouldn't fit on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. It basically, I had to print it out on multiple sheets and I taped it up on the wall of my office, and it pretty much filled up a space about 10 by 12 feet, showing everything. But it gave a really good way of visualizing what was going on. And also, if we had any delays in any of the activities, you just put into the software the delay. We thought it was going to take 3 days, but it actually is taking 10 days. What impact does that have on the end date? It may have no impact. There are some critical activities that are not on, and the term you'll hear is critical path. And that what that means is if that time, that activity finishes early or finishes late, it doesn't affect the overall project completion date. And so when you have delays that happen in a non-critical path item, it's not as concerning because it's not affecting the total completion. But if something is on the critical path and you run into a problem, that is important because it will affect your project directly. So it allows you to focus on the really important stuff, but those items that are not on the critical path, if they delay too long, they can become part of the critical path. So you don't forget about those either, but it helps you prioritize. Fabulous tool. One of the most commonly used that I used a lot was Microsoft Project. There are other tools out there as well. Okay, execution. The role of a project manager really is to coordinate. You don't do the activities, but you make sure everyone has everything that they need to accomplish the tasks that they're responsible for. What I told my team is that I was a demolition expert. And by that, what I meant is if they ran into a roadblock that was impacting their ability to complete their tasks, they needed to come to me and let me know so I could blow up the roadblock. And I did. When someone would come with me with a problem, purchasing is saying that they won't approve this. I went into the manager of purchasing, told them why we needed to have this and what needed to go on, and I got that roadblock taken away. Delegation of tasks is important. If you have things that you can delegate to others, do it, because your role as a project manager really is to make sure everything is going okay, it's on track. The more tasks that you take on yourself, the less focus you have. Monitoring, tracking in progress. And that's where the Gantt chart was so valuable because I could put in the latest updated information each day. I would call the various departments and say, how are you with this task? With each of those tasks, you can enter in a completion percentage. So if I talk to manufacturing, I say, how close are we to duplicating that those fixtures that we need? And they say, well, we're about 50% done. So I could put in 50% so that I could keep track on it. The predecessors, the idea there is understanding what has to happen before something else can happen. And that kind of feeds into what I already talked about with the critical path, that when you understand those things that are absolutely, you need to stay on top of them because any hiccup in any of those critical path items will affect the outcome. I already mentioned about closing. I believe in having a parting celebrating. We end in an orderly way, but a fun way. Whatever, your organization does, we had punch and cake, an afternoon meeting with everybody, and coffee, to recognize we made it, we're done. But as part of that meeting, before we celebrated, we did a debrief. So what did we learn from this? What went really, I always start out with what went really well. Then you say, boy, if we ever do something like this again, we want to make sure we do that because that worked really well. But then on the flip side, what were the problems we ran into? So that the next time we do a project like this, we want to say, we need to be careful about this or make sure don't do it that way. That did not work. So capture that, the lessons learned, it's really valuable. So I like the summary of an effective project manager. You do have to be a leader, no question. Excellent communication abilities, that is just paramount. You have to be able to communicate effectively. And like in my case, I was transferring from the United States to Japan. We had members from our Japanese sister company were part of this project as well. So I had to be communicating with a different culture, a different time zone, with different expectations. So you do have to be a very effective communicator to be successful. And that really feeds into the next one, outstanding people skills. People have to like you in order to really want to work hard for you. But then the other one too is that you need to be competent. The people need to be able to respect you so that when you say this is how we need to do this, they're not questioning your understanding of it. Now, you don't have to be an expert at everything, especially if you have good listening skills, because you can listen to what people are saying and be able to reflect back and say, okay, what I'm hearing you say is that the reason you think this should go this way is this. But here's the problem I see. If they know that you've been listening to them, that you heard what they said, they'll be more willing to accept the fact when you say, I get where you're coming from, but we can't do it that way. We have to do it this other way. And certainly to be successful, you have to be able to build a strong team. In my case, like I said, I had team members in Japan. I had sales and marketing, engineering, manufacturing, purchasing, a wide variety of people. And I had to pull them together. These were people that didn't necessarily interact with each other on a day-to-day basis. And of course, you have to be able to present information. So, which is part of the communication abilities. Really, the excellent communication abilities goes along with excellent presentation. Certainly, one-on-one communication is important, but I had to be able also to communicate to a large group of around 100 people that were being impacted by this. But then another really important one is this good problem solving and critical thinking skills. Doing all the planning up front was great, and it took care of a lot of things. But there were things that we didn't think about at the beginning that when we got into the middle of the project, we went, oops, now what are we going to do? Something you may not know is that after World War II, Japan was divided in half. The United States took ownership and responsibility for rebuilding half of Japan, and Europe took ownership and responsibility to overseeing the rebuilding of the other half. You go, well, so what? Well, in the United States, electrical power is 120 volts, 60 hertz. Europe, the power is 240 volts, 50 hertz. And so Japan is split. Half the country is 120 volts, 60 hertz. The other half is 240 volts, 50 hertz. And sure enough, the location we were setting up the manufacturing cell was in the 240 volt, 50 hertz part of the country. Some of our test equipment was only set up to work on 120 volt, 60 hertz. We found that out literally a few days before we were shipping everything. So we had to scramble and find out, okay, how can we convert the test equipment so it will work and everything else. It did not impact our schedule and timeline. Like I said, we still came in ahead of our schedule and under budget. But those things are going to happen that you didn't see coming. There's no question. And of course, lastly, is kind of a summary of all of this, being able to keep the team on track, managing things, overseeing everything. It's a lot. But when you get to the goal and you did like I did, you got there early and under budget, that's a great feeling. It can be a lot of fun, a lot of hard work, but a lot of fun. As I mentioned, there are software tools to help both with managing time, managing people and resources, managing costs. And I showed you that example of a Gantt chart. You can have in that with the actual duration, how much is it completed. You can also include costs into that. It will also manage resources. So if your project involves being able to use a particular piece of equipment, you can have in there what the other um, uh, normal day-to-day activities, so that, well, we can only have access to that molding machine 4 hours once a week. So you can put resource constraints in there too. So I was successful, but why do some projects fail? As we saw with the ERP, it can be lack of senior management support. Now, fortunately, I had the general manager's support, and he had explained why we're doing this to all of senior management. So I had support from all the key executives. There can be lack of the stakeholder involvement. That's why it was so important I had Japan involved in what we were doing, because they were going to be the ultimate recipient of this project. We were sending a system to them. So if we had just sent it to them without having their involvement in it, they would have been less inclined to make it work. But because they were part of the team and they felt they were part of the team, they had ownership to it. Unclear requirements. That's why I said it was so important at the beginning that I made sure I understood from, I got the input from the various departments. What exactly did we have to do to make this happen? But here's a killer that can come in. Now, in my case of the project I've explained to you, scope creep was not an issue. It was pretty clear and defined. We're doing this, manufacturing cell. But on other projects, you can have, well, this is what we've decided it's going to do. But then halfway through, senior manager says, it'd be really nice if it could also do this. And then someone else says, yeah, but I would like it to, to also do this over here. And it's really important with a project that you freeze the scope of the project. When you launch the project, no more changes. This is what we're doing. That's why I had everyone sign the charter of the project. We were all putting a stake in the ground saying, this is what we're doing, and this is the timeline we're doing it in. Any changes to that I would have had to agree to, and you would have really had to twist my arm to make changes, because I knew that any changes in the scope have a potential to create a total train wreck. Poor communications. Like I said, I was on the phone, weekly conference calls with Japan. I had weekly meetings with all the key team members. I also went down on the floor, and the people that were working on creating replicating the manufacturing cell, I was down there on a daily basis, just walking through saying, hi, how are things going? Wanted to keep those communication channels really strong and going. But as I said before, the real killer is scope creep. You gotta avoid that at all costs. So if you're in a role as a project manager, you usually don't have just one project. Now, in the case I gave you, the example I gave you, I was fortunate in that was all I had to do. For 6 months, that was my charter. I didn't have to do anything else. But a lot of times you'll have multiple projects that you're going on. And one of the key issues, deciding which projects to pursue. There was a senior engineer that a company I worked for, and one of his favorite sayings was to say, we can do anything, but we can't do everything. So you may be presented with 10 possible projects that you could pursue. But the reality is you probably can't pursue all of them. There are some that you have to look at return on investment and say, no, this project does not make sense. You may have to reject a request or go to senior management and say, I know you asked me to do this, but this does not make sense. Um, Look at it. How important is this project to the competitive strategy for the company? Are there compliance and other risks that doing this project could reduce? So could we avoid a potential problem in the future by doing it? These are things that help to go into deciding that this is a good project. This company that I worked at, we had a weekly meeting with senior management. It was called the Go No Go Committee. And a new project would come in, and that committee would talk about it on these various things, the return on investment. How does it affect our competitive strategy if we don't do it? And so the competition does it. What are the risks there and so forth? And we would decide whether to say, yes, let's do it, or no, we're going to pass on this one. And we turned down some significantly large pieces of business because we looked at it and said, no, it would be too much of a drain on the organization. We're already running at capacity. We don't have the additional capacity to do this, a variety of reasons. But the key is you do sometimes say no. And then, of course, once you have those things that have been approved, you need to manage and track those projects. And there's a number of ways that you can do it. Again, software tools that can help you keep track of tools. And I like the example the author gave here because it shows priority and the completion. So, you could look at mobile device management. It's 88% completed. It's only a priority 2, but it's so close to being done. Let's just get it done. Whereas you could look at mobile device encryption. It's a priority 1, but it's only 15% completed. So it can help you to make a decision on, which ones do we put our efforts on if we can't do them all at the same time. Now, if you can do them all at the same time, great, but you might have to prioritize, is the point. I like that the author talked about disaster recovery. You need to really have plans in place for what do you do when the unthinkable happens. And you start by listing out what are the types of disasters that could happen and what are the consequences. So, certainly natural disasters and the impact that has on the infrastructure, security breaches. Boy, those are certainly common these days. Pandemic. We all learned the hard way. What do you do when people can't come to work or people are sick so they can't come to work? And what happens when there's an environmental, crisis that occurs? So by listing them out and the possible consequences, it allows you to then put in plans so that if there's a natural disaster, and so we can't run our manufacturing facility because we don't have any electrical power, how do we communicate with our customers? Do we have things in place? Is our website hosted in a different location so the website can be up and we can put up a notice saying, currently our manufacturing location is without power and we apologize for the delay or whatever. But it allows us to put in to create a plan for these when they happen. It's really important to think through, this, because it's not if a disaster is going to happen, it's when a disaster happens, here's what we will do. Now, one term you may hear talked about, it's called a black swan event. And What this refers to is that there's a really low probability of occurring. And it got the term black swan because Europeans believed that there was no such thing, for a long time as a black swan because no one had ever seen it. They assumed that they were all white. But then lo and behold, a black swan was spotted. So it was something that people thought couldn't occur. So these are events that you think, well, that would never happen, or the probability of that happening is extremely low. But it could have immense impact on technology, science. And oftentimes, black swan events are very costly to prepare for. You say, well, the chance of this occurring is so slim, there's no point in spending all this money for it. And that can be a legitimate decision, but it's wishful thinking. And so the key is with black swan events, is to know they may be very low probability of happening, but if the consequences are extremely high, we still may need to put in, can we do some mitigation? Maybe we can't, it's too costly to totally prevent it. But are there things that we can put in place to mitigate the consequences in the unlikely event that this happens? So to summarize this, really important to have a clear, crystal clear project definition, not only in your mind, but that the team members and others impacted agree on the project definition. You have to manage everything that's going on. Assume you get into trouble when you assume that no news is good news. No news is just no news. That's why, like I said, I was walking the floor, talking to people constantly. I wasn't waiting for them to tell me, oh, we may have a problem. Project management software, there's some really good tools out there to help you. You need to capture, record the successes and failures. Let this be a learning experience for the next time. Strategic planning, of course, is important. Understanding the human element. Humans are not perfect. People make mistakes. It's like what I ran into in my transfer of the manufacturing cell. Nobody thought about the power differences in Japan. I venture to say none of us realized that until this came up. We went, really? We had just assumed that they were 120 volts, 60 hertz. Human beings are fallible. We overlooked a pretty important part. So anyhow, hopefully that gives you an overview of project management. It can be applied even if your role is not a project manager. You still, in whatever role you have in an organization, you work on projects. Using these principles and tools can help you be successful. And if it's something that you really find enjoyable, you can get a degree in project management. There are also non-degree programs. There's professional certification programs where you can be a certified project manager. I found it to be a very rewarding career.